Hi. Welcome. We're ready to get started, so take your seats. Hey, everyone. Good evening. I'm Faye Rosenfeld, and I am the Vice President of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library. And I'm really thrilled to welcome all of you to Live from NYPL with Tom Steyer and David Wallace-Wells. They're here to talk about Tom's new book. In fact, it's so new that it's actually not officially being published until next week, so you're all getting a sneak peek. And the book is entitled Cheaper, Faster, Better: How We'll Win the Climate War. I think it's probably safe to say that everyone who's here, whether you're here physically in the room or you're watching online, has made the decision to attend tonight's program because of a deep concern about climate change. We share that concern. It's a subject that we return to again and again in our programming here at Live, whether through the lens of climate fiction with authors like Amitav Ghosh and Nathaniel Rich, or convenings with leading writers and experts like Elizabeth Colbert, Ayanna Johnson, and Catherine Hayhoe. We are particularly excited about tonight's program, not only because our two guests are absolute luminaries in this field, but because we also believe that Tom's very important new book and the conversation you're about to hear will inspire you to act and think differently about climate change. Tom Steyer is a renowned climate champion, an expert on green technologies, an investor, a philanthropist, and 2020 Democratic presidential candidate, a campaign he launched specifically to put climate on the election agenda. Joining Tom in conversation is journalist David Wallace-Wells. He's the author of the #1 New York Times bestselling book, The Uninhabitable Earth, and numerous articles on climate change, science, politics, and other fascinating subjects, including a 2017 New York Magazine article that inspired his book and that went on to become the most widely read article in that magazine's history. We just couldn't be more proud to have both of them here at the library and also to do our part, such as it is, in the fight against climate change by helping launch Tom's new book and his message of hope out into the world. A quick program note, the conversation's gonna last around 45 minutes, and after that, Tom and David will take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please write it down on the note card that you were given when you came into the room, and one of my wonderful colleagues will come around to collect your cards. And if you're with us online, just drop your question into the chat, or you can also send us an email at publicprograms@nypl.org. And after that, for those of you who have not yet bought the book, you'll have an opportunity to do that. The library shop will be selling copies right outside the room, and then Tom will be signing them back up here on stage. And after May 28th, you can also check out books using your library card. All purchases made here support the New York Public Library. And speaking of support, if you'll just all indulge me for just a minute, I'm sure many of you are aware that the library is facing an unprecedented $58.3 million cut in our city funding, on top of cuts that we already absorbed earlier in the year, which forced us to close branches on Sundays and eliminate other services. So your support is more important than ever. Please write to the mayor. Tell them to stop, to restore funding for libraries. You can just go to nypl.org/speakout, add your name to a note, and it will be sent instantly to the mayor and other officials. They really do need to hear from all New Yorkers who value what we do here at libraries, so that we can continue to bring you all this wonderful free programming and everything else that we do in our 92 locations. Okay, with that, that's my commercial. Thank you. With that, thank you again so much for being here, and please welcome Tom Steyer and David Wallace-Wells.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. Thank all of you in the audience for being here. I am really excited to be on stage with you, humbled also, but excited about the conversation and about this book. I'm excited to see the book out in the world, making its mark. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next hour or so. The format's gonna be, we're gonna talk for 30, 40 minutes, then we're gonna do some Q&A with the audience. So at some point, people will start giving out note cards that you then will write your questions on, and then they're gonna pass them up to me, and I'll ask Tom, only the best ones, but I'll ask Tom a bunch of good questions at the end. Well,
David, you should know, this is 100% my family. So Every question will be coming from a bad place.
And yeah, we'll get some embarrassing answers, I hope too. So I want to start where you started the book, which is to say, you have in the intro, you talk about some time you spent in Alaska in 1981, and then a return trip you made in, I think, 2006 that really, really shocked you at the scale and speed of the change that you saw there, and was a kind of a climate awakening for you. And I want to ask you in a minute about how things seem different now in 2024 than they did in 2006, but maybe we should start with that feeling, that overwhelming feeling that you had then. What was the revelation to you? What did shock you, and what did it make you feel about what you needed to do?
So, first of all, the reason I went in 1981 is I got the job at the age of 24 to advise the government of Alaska on what to do with the excess tax revenues coming off the North Slope, which seems like a daunting job for a 24-year-old. But I really went there. It was a summer job just before business school, and I went because I wanted to see the out-of-doors in Alaska, because I figured it was the most untouched place in North America. You want to see what North America looks like before the Europeans showed up? Okay, go to Alaska and go as far as you can and see what it looked like. And I was very excited about that, and in fact, I got a great chance to do it. And I spent a ton of every spare moment I spent going as far from Anchorage or Fairbanks as I could to see what natural North America looked like. And it was awe-inspiring. I loved it. I had an incredible time. I came back to New York and thought I was going to move to Alaska forever. And my family said, "You're absolutely not doing that." But then I wanted my family to see it, my wife and 4 kids, because I thought they should see what wilderness looks like, what fecundity looks like, what that many mammals and fish and birds and trees, how big it is, how grand it is. I thought they should understand that, because it is, to me, a fascinating, important subject. But we went, and what we saw was how much it melted. I remember going to this valley. I'm looking at my daughter who was there, and the valley had been a huge mountain of snow so that you could not consider looking across the valley. There was just a gigantic mountain of snow. And so no one would ever known what it looked like underneath, and it was totally gone. And so, David, actually what happened was, it wasn't that it was new information. It was information in a way that I could process that, oh my God, what I'd been reading about in the papers and pretty much ignoring.
Yeah.
Was something which was happening on such a gigantic, vast, and visual scale that it wasn't just me. I mean, our whole family went back to San Francisco and sat around the table and said, wow, oh my God, is this the thing we should be focusing on? Is this the thing which we should try to work on? Because it seems like it's so vast and people aren't aware of it who don't go see it, because it really brought it home in a visceral way.
And that's 2006, so that's before An Inconvenient Truth. It's before, Katrina was 2005, right? So it's right in that period when Americans are going from it being on the periphery of our political, social consciousness to being somewhat more central. We're still, still need to make progress there. But this is, a period of kind of climate awakening for a lot of people. And just to set the scene a little bit, it also, it feels recent, 2006, relatively recent, but we've put a quarter of all the carbon emissions we've ever put into the atmosphere in the history of humanity since 2006. We often tell ourselves, and we were talking about this a little bit backstage, that information is enough, that once we know the scale of the problem, we're going to take action. We need to spread the word. We need to, share the gospel. But I think, one way of looking at how different things are even now than they were in 2006 is that, is to realize that information is an important tool, a component part of the solution, but not the whole solution. So how do you see that story, the story from 2006 to the present? I think you talk in the book about, the speed of impacts accelerating. You talk about the total indifference of the oil and gas business, and you talk about the incredible pace of the green energy transition as being like the sort of 3 big trends that are happening right now, really reshaping this story. Tell us a little bit about each of those and how they are reshaping your understanding of the state of play with climate, how they've changed your perspective since 2006, and where you think we're heading.
Sure. And let me say, David, I want to finish up with information, because I think that maybe it's because I'm from Northern California, but I think information and the technology for providing information today really does change the world. But first of all, in terms of the natural world, which David knows better than me and probably as well as anyone on the planet, obviously the news from nature is terrible. And the news from nature was terrible this morning, and it was terrible yesterday, and it was terrible on Monday morning. And it's continuous, and almost every piece of news is bad in terms of all the data about what's happening in terms of glaciers and ocean temperature and air temperature and what's happening in the Amazon. There are a million things to say and lots of studies, and they come out all the time, and almost they're uniformly worse than expected and worse than the trend. The second thing is, this is one of the basic points about what's going on in terms of our climate is that no one is going to be nice. People are going to, customers, companies are going to do what's in their, countries are going to do what's in their self-interest. And that's the world we live in. So that, the name of the book is Cheaper, Faster, Better. That's how we win the climate war. And the reason that's because that means you're winning on the merits. You're not asking someone to do you a favor because no one's going to do you a favor. So when we think about how this is going to go, we have to produce cheaper, better products that everybody wants, and we just kill the opposition. That they're the best, and so people go to them in kind of the traditional industrial way that people go to new technologies since people stopped using whale blubber as the basic energy in the United States of America. We have to kill whale blubber. And that's just a fact. But what we're seeing, and what I see in my day job as an investor in climate solutions, is that our ability to do this since 2006 is completely different. That basically, to use just a couple very simple examples, but ubiquitous ones that people don't always understand. In 2006, solar and wind were much more expensive on a per kilowatt hour basis than fossil fuel energy, either coal, natural gas, or oil. Now they're much cheaper, much cheaper. That is, they are probably a third the cost of fossil fuel energy. And if you look last year globally, 86% of new electricity generation, so new electric plants, were renewable, not because anyone was being nice, because it's cheaper. And I'll tell you one other story, which is on this line. One of my best friends in the world, I would describe as a business Republican. Conservative, aware, not, old-fashioned business values about what drives a society well. And about 6 years ago, he bought a Tesla. And he'd been driving very, very expensive Italian sports cars. And I said, Matthew, huh? Tesla? Have you grown a conscience? He goes, absolutely not. Great pickup. Incredible ride. It accelerates much better than any internal combustion driven car. And it handles much better. This is the greatest. And that's my point. It's not just cheaper and faster. These are products. People buy things for lots of reasons. It's not always just cost. And what we're trying to say is the way we're going to win this is in the marketplace with better products, which people are producing. And I see all the time the 1,000 innovations that are going to make a difference. But let me say the last thing about information. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. We can't solve this problem unless everybody knows exactly what's going on in terms of emissions and can really manage can measure what's going on so that the people of good who are trying to do the right thing can know where the emissions are coming from and can change it, so that people who are their customers can know what they're doing, so that governments can know what they're doing. It's really important that we have the information to strategically make decisions at every part of society. And that is something that you have to build. Those systems don't, suddenly spring up magically. But when they're in place, I think that's how we get a strategic handle on this and actually take the innovations in terms of gadgets and electricity and all that stuff and put them to use fully in society. That's how we're going to win.
So taking the most basic measure, talking about measuring things, we produced more carbon emissions last year as a globe than we've ever produced before, right? So
absolutely,
we're in this position where we see the green transition racing forward. We can imagine a lot of the ways it's going to transform our lives in relatively short order. But there's that big ongoing production of carbon emissions from dirty sources that is happening at the same time. When and how is that going to change? Like, at what point are we going to, rather than just supplementing this huge system of fossil fuel production, are we actually going to be using our new capacity to replace it? Yeah.
So, as David said, numbers really count. So let me give you a few numbers just to put in perspective that the fact that CO2 emissions went up 1.1% last year, which is the highest ever. Having said that, the US went down 4%. We're about 11, 12% of global emissions. Europe went down 4%. They're about 7% of global emissions. China went up 5%. They're over 30% of global emissions. And India went up 7%. And they're roughly 6 or 7% of global emissions. So when we think about how this is going to play out in the future, David, we have to accept, this is going to be played out in countries in terms of emissions from countries outside the US and Europe. The US and Europe are on trajectories where we're going to pretty much do what we say we're going to do in terms of reducing emissions very, very substantially by 2030 and putting ourselves, and that's, we can talk a lot about the politics, and I'm happy to, but that's going to be based on the economics. Trump can't stop people from buying cheap power. Trump can't stop people from buying better stuff. But the real question, this story is going to be told in India, China, in the short run, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, much more than it is here. And then the next stage will be what happens in the rest of the developing world, specifically Africa.
And how can we get those transformations to happen faster? If the fate of the planet's future is going to be written in China and India and sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, like, what is there to do from positions in the US to make that happen faster rather than slower?
So I hope this isn't going to be too boring. Maybe it is. The simple thing is to say the US's role in this is to produce the products and the technologies that they can't afford not to buy. So when, and let's take, one of the things we have to accept that's also true is there is a huge north-south political issue around climate. And so the north-south political issue about climate is that the northern countries in this planet have produced the overwhelming amount of CO2 emissions. The southern countries on this planet suffer much more. The rule of climate is the less you've done to cause the problem, the more you're going to suffer. And the people in the southern hemisphere know that, and they're not happy about it. And so if we say to India, the most populous country in the world, which is going to have 5 times as much electricity generation in 2050 as they have now. So they're going to build an enormous amount of electricity. And we say, we need you to build renewables. We need you to build renewables. They will say, you've cumulatively emitted the most. On a per capita basis, you still emit many multiples of what every one of us do. We are much poorer than you. We have not caused the problem, we are not causing the problem, and you're telling us we need to save you so you can keep your fancy lifestyles. Forget it. That is the north-south political issue in a nutshell.
Can I just put a couple numbers to that just to make it really clear? So, the US has done about a quarter of all the damage that's been done historically, which is, China is almost certain not to surpass us at any point, which means we're going to be the world's largest polluters in a cumulative basis forever. And the amount of damage that we've done, you can measure it by weight, and there's more carbon hanging in the atmosphere than the total mass of everything we've ever built on planet Earth. So we've done more damage to the planet's climate and the atmosphere than we've transformed the surface of the planet itself. The average American refrigerator uses more carbon every year than the average resident of Nigeria, which isn't even a poor country by African standards, it's a middle-income country. The average resident of Mali uses less carbon than the average British tea kettle. These are just unbelievably large differentials. And all told, all of sub-Saharan Africa, close to 1 billion people, many hundreds of them, hundreds of millions of them without electricity at this point, has produced in historically cumulative terms 2% 5%, maybe less, of all historical emissions. So they've basically done, I mean, really it's a rounding error. And these days we don't even really know all that much about the climate impacts there because we don't even study it all that well because we don't care about it as a scientific or political community. So there are all of these different ways in which these jagged injustices are unfolding through the story of climate. And in that context, I want to ask you, you have a lot of optimism about the green transition. I do too, given enough time. But the question is the time it's going to take and what amount of climate impacts and suffering we will make inevitable through our delay. And the subtitle of your book is, it's about winning. In this context where the world's already warmer than it's ever been, we're all dealing with the news stories that you mentioned earlier every day, what counts as a win? How do we know that we've won? What are we shooting for here?
Okay. Look, from my standpoint, winning here, we are not going back to 1950, 1850, or 1750. That is not happening in this world. That's why I wanted to go to Alaska, because I wanted to know what it looked like before we really started to change the natural world so dramatically. I think winning means getting to net zero, first of all. But more than that, winning means that we stay in control. I mean, there's an assumption that there's a relationship between emissions, CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere, and air temperature. And that's how most people who think about climate at all think about it. And under those scenarios, we're in control. If we emit less, there's less CO2 in the atmosphere, and therefore the Earth is less warm, or warms less. Actually, that's true until it isn't true. Because in my mind, the scary thing about this is not that we can't win under that arithmetic relationship. We definitely can, and I believe we definitely will. The issue that we're playing with is, at what point do we change so many systems in this world that now they're just changed and they have a momentum of their own and we no longer in control? And that's something that this world and the people in this room and the people in this country haven't believed in a long time. For a long time we felt like we can innovate our way out, we can, manufacture our way out, we can think our way out. In the old days, people did not think that. They thought God was in control and these things just happened, and they definitely didn't think that they were controlling the weather. They thought the weather was controlling them. And if we melt the tundra, if we break systems so that they get a life and a momentum of their own, then we're not in control. And that, to me, I know we can win the arithmetic around emissions, but we have to do it as David said, doing it slowly is going to cost immense human suffering. But more than that, if we break these primary systems that we never think about, that are the guts of our world, we're going to be in a situation where our control of emissions is still important, but by no means really controls the outcomes anymore. And that is losing. As long as we stay in control, I believe we will win.
And in your book, you spend a lot of time writing about the opposition of the incumbent industries, oil and gas, their sort of bad behavior, and writing about the ways in which they are slowing down that transition and making some of that math harder for us to solve. I just wanted to have you talk for a minute or two about that particular challenge, like the way, to what degree, the fossil fuel business is the villain here. What have they done wrong? How much are they slowing us down? And what can we do to get them out of the way so that we can move faster?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me say that the fossil fuel industry is not monolithic, and we definitely need them to participate in this transition. I think that there are organizations and businesses within the fossil fuel industry who have been proactive. If you look at the UN conference in Dubai in 2023, that's the first time that every country in the world said we need to transition off fossil fuels, and it was led by the United Arab Emirates. That was who ran that COP. They're the people who pushed through that resolution. They did it as a major fossil fuel producing country, and they're really trying to be leaders in the transition. So there are people out there who have been part of the fossil fuel industry and continue to be, but are also trying to lead the transition. I think that if you look globally, the people who have not accepted the data and have in fact tried to act as if the data weren't true, even when they knew it was, have been American oil and gas companies. And, to a large extent, they have said things that did not comport with what we all knew from scientific fact, and which they specifically knew internally.
Yeah, a lot of the early science we have about climate comes actually from the oil and gas companies.
And so we need to, when I think about this, I think of this as, this is just taking in information from a bunch of sources, including very specifically science sources, and trying to think logically, how do we deal with this? And I think that the opposition is really trying to ignore the data and says things that don't comport with what seem to be straightforward facts in a kind of magical thinking, which is, Mom will never catch us doing this, so we should just keep doing this. Well, eventually, you can't ignore the facts. So to a very large extent, what we need to do here, in my mind, is to succeed in the marketplace, keep telling the truth, because you don't win with magical thinking. In this world, magical thinking eventually disappears of its own weight. And so that's why I definitely think there's reason I wrote this book was to say we need to look at this clearly, which is we have a real problem and we have real solutions, and we need to go after those real solutions as a society very hard together. And that definitely should include the major oil companies, the major energy companies, and they're going to have to start dealing with the data, including the data from the natural world, which is very available, where there are lots of scientists reporting on this, where people are changing their careers to report on it because they think it's so important, and I agree with them.
So what does that look like to you, oil and gas business participating in the transition? Because, most of the science that I'm familiar with says, all of their they're already planned stuff, they're already planned infrastructure, they're already made investments are more than enough to pull us way past the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Accords and probably pull us past the 2 degree target, right? What does it mean for them to participate? Like, at what pace are they moving away from the bad stuff? In what form are they moving away from the bad stuff? And what policy levers should we be thinking about to get them to move faster on those points?
So just to take a step back, because I know most of the people in this room are familiar with what David's talking about in terms of 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Sorry to talk
But
over
as I
that.
like to say, in America, we have this terrible problem, and it's about 1.5 degrees Celsius, and no one even knows what Celsius means. And it's all about carbon dioxide, which is a huge problem, which you have never seen, touched, or smelt. Gigantic problem. And everyone's like, what? What I would say, what David was saying is if you just do the proved oil and gas reserves on the books of companies and countries, it takes us way past 2.5 or 3. So the question is, why are you digging for more oil and gas if we can't produce what we have in a safe world? Why are you building infrastructure that will last 40 to 60 years when we know we have to get to net zero by 2050, which is a hell of a lot shorter than 40 to 60 years? How could that possibly make sense? How is that a logical business decision in terms of returns? So when I think about this, to me, the question is, are we going to start taking into account the impacts of investment in business away from just this year's bottom line? And there are a lot of ways in which that can happen, but in the real world, it's happening. Every single day you can read about things that could not have happened if it weren't for climate change, and none of them are good. And so how are we going to change? People are going to have to basically open up their aperture and say, this may look good this year, but this will not work for us in the next 3 years. Or this will not work for us in the next 5 years. And that is inevitable. And so you don't build, we have a 5-year problem here. You don't build a 60-year piece of infrastructure for a 5-year problem, because that is not a good investment. And so I think that people are going to have to start actually being more data-driven in this and start to deal with the facts on the ground, including all the facts on the ground.
And do you think it's possible to do net zero by 2050? I mean, you said we have to, but do you think it's possible?
So yes, I do. Let me say this. Most people think the world happens in straight lines. But I think for people who study technology and business change and most big changes, it doesn't happen in straight lines. It happens, I mean, we tend to think of it as S-curves, like a very slow build up until you're in a position where you're much better, and then it goes straight up in terms of change. So the old Hemingway quote, which I'm sure most of you know, how did you go bankrupt? 2 ways, slowly and then all at once. That's how we're going to solve this problem, is we're going to go to a place where the ability to change it happens, and then like last year, 87% or 86% of electricity generation worldwide is renewable. That's an S-curve. That's saying, oh no, it's now much, 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 much better. And so do I believe that will happen? I do. And there's an assumption in there, which I do believe, which is we are going to start to include all of the factors in these decisions because everyone is going to be suffering. And it is not clear exactly how that will be brought into the computer programs of people making financial decisions. But I believe that information is the first step, but that overwhelmingly it will be impossible to avoid those facts, and it will be impossible not to include them in basic computer programs when people are penciling out how much does it cost to build an electricity generating facility in India. Okay, part of that is going to be how long is that facility going to be permitted to run? Are we going to be charged for the damage we're doing? And conversely, are we going to get paid for doing things that help people in terms of emissions and sequestration, which I also think will happen. We are going to pay people money all over the world and hundreds of billions of dollars every year to sequester carbon. That is the other thing that's going to happen, and I hope that it's done in a way so it basically transferred money from the global north to the global south.
Yeah, kind of a climate reparations via carbon removal approach, yeah.
But without anybody being forced to do anything they want to do, just a market, people paying money for value.
So just to talk about the values here, I mean, one thing that I keep returning to is that the Biden EPA recently revised what's called the social cost of carbon, which is its estimate for the damage that a single marginal ton of CO2 will do. And they revised it. It was like $40, $50 in the Obama years per ton, $40, $50 during the Obama years. Trump put it down to like $3 or $4 or something. It's now at $190 per ton, and it's actually 2019 dollars. So in 2022 dollars, it's like $220 a ton. And that means that this is not like fringe radical science. This is like the Biden EPA's official estimate. That means that the U.S. is now doing every year about $1 trillion in climate damages. Like that is the Biden administration's EPA's estimate of the cost of the burning the fossil fuel that we're doing right now is $1 trillion. And almost all of that, maybe according to some estimates, even more than all of it, because the US is sort of benefiting from warming still, is being put on the developing world. So which every year we are, according to the Biden EPA, imposing climate damages of $1 trillion. And that just calls to mind, I mean, you mentioned the sort of north-south political dynamics, but it also raises question of domestic political dynamics, which is like, when I mention this to John Kerry, he's like, but I can't talk about this in America. Joe Biden doesn't want to talk about the US doing $1 trillion of damage per year. You've talked a lot about market dynamics. You've talked a lot about the technology tonight, and all of that, I think is exactly as you described. Things are racing forward in remarkable ways beyond what I thought was possible just a few years ago. But there's also politics, right? I mean, you did run for president, so it's like we can't just trust the market. There's also a political element. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, particularly in the US, how you see the evolving landscape of climate politics. So first of all, I guess like how you think about, assess, judge Joe Biden's climate record, and then what you think is at stake in November, just in terms of climate.
So let me say this. the first thing about free markets is there is no such thing as a free market. You know, we all grow up with those words and we think somehow God came down and ordained markets. And that's just not true. Every market has rules that are made by human beings. The original markets, the rule is, where's the market? Who gets which stall? What are the hours of the market? God did not make up the hours for the market in Athens. And if you look at the United States, we used to say it's completely legal to hire a 12-year-old for a 14-hour day and pay him a quarter. We decided that wasn't so good. It's no longer, God did not come down and say that's not good. Human beings looked at this society and said, we aren't doing that anymore. That's not right. So when we think about any market, there are rules for that market that are ordained by society, hopefully to push private enterprise to produce the things that are good for society and to protect people in this society from the excesses of capitalism. And so when we think about the energy market, you know, there are the rules that we use in energy. What David just said, as far as I was concerned, is we didn't know it, but it turned out that fossil fuels have pollution that you can't see, smell, or touch, and that it's causing a lot of damage. But they're not paying for that damage because they've never paid for that damage, and people like not paying for stuff. Well, not paying for $1 trillion seems like a pretty good deal to me too. I would like to not pay for $1 trillion. It's totally normal. So when we think about politics, the question is not what is the right thing to do, it's also what is the possible thing to do, and the things don't always line up, I assure you. So when you think about what President Biden has done, he basically has done a whole bunch of capital, basically government capital, to incent clean type behavior in the marketplace. Most famously, the Inflation Reduction Act. Okay, the Inflation Reduction Act is basically a carbon tax standing on your head. Instead of charging people for polluting, you're paying the people who don't pollute. And why would you do that? Because obviously, putting a tax is a lot simpler than paying people and trying to figure out every single place where people aren't polluting and then paying them, because they can't pass a carbon tax. So when we think about this world, we have a very, you know, in Econ 101, I would have solved this in the first 2 weeks. It's simple. In a political world, that's not possible. So when I think about what President Biden has done, that's the biggest climate bill in American history by many multiples.
And it's probably bigger than you heard, because
it's way bigger than you think, and it's way bigger than they said. If you look at his cabinet, almost every single person in that cabinet has some form of professed or serious climate cred. They wanted this to be, you know, I would say in the book, you got to basically take an attitude that this is something that should be part of every decision. It should be part of where you live, what you drive, how you heat your house, what you choose to do, how you vote. It's like we need to do this, and we need to do this across the board all the time in order to get a handle on this, which is fine. We can definitely do that. I think the Biden administration has tried to do that, and I think they've tried to do it, you know, in the world of the possible. And the world of the possible is a lot tougher than the world, you know, just writing it down on a piece of paper and talking to your friends about it over dinner.
And what do you think in the U.S., putting aside the threat of Trump, which we could talk about in a second, but in the U.S., like what are the obstacles standing in the way of a faster transition, faster rollout of renewables, faster?
Look, let me give you an example of what people are saying and what I think is really happening, which is why I'm optimistic. You know, if there's a state where the elected officials have talked more about the dangers and communism of ESG than Texas, I'm not sure what it is. And they would agree with that. They're thrilled that they're that state. Okay, Texas has tripled its amount of solar in the last 3 years. It's supposed to go up another 35% this year. Texas produces more wind on every basis than any other state in the United States. Do they do that because they're nice? Do they do that because they secretly believe in ESG? No. They do it because it's cheap. They do it because it's a better deal. And so when I look at this, I know that the framework for capitalism is written by governments. The laws are written by governments to represent everybody, not just the capitalists, not just the people making money, but the people in society whose homes are going to be flooded, who are going to be dealing with the tornadoes, for the people who are going to have no water to drink, for all the impacts. That's what the government's supposed to do. And so right now, with an administration trying very hard, but an awful lot of subsidy built into the status quo, we are still winning. And we will win. And the only thing, from a policy standpoint in the United States of America right now, we are winning and we will win faster. Because the technology is here and the value is here. And as I like to say, look, 330 million Americans are smarter than whale blubber or decaying dinosaurs. And every year we're going to get increasingly smarter and we're going to win more.
And do you feel that way if next year there's a different person in the White House?
So, obviously, I'm a Democrat. For my many sins, I'm a Democrat. And I'm aware of what the proposals are coming out of the Heritage Foundation around energy for 2025 in a Republican administration. Yes. Do I think that, like King Canute, he can put his chair in the waves and order the waves to stop coming in? No, I don't. I think that a third the cost of energy is still a third the cost of energy, no matter what you say. What I do think the real key to this is, which does seem to me to be significant, is this. This is a global problem. You ask me how we're going to work together. We have to work together. We're going to work together on technology and share it. We're going to work together on finance and help. We're going to work together to build global systems for sequestration so we can pay people to basically suck carbon out of the air and stick it back into the ground. Those are going to be things that are going to require international cooperation. If there's one thing that a Trump administration is definitely not going to lead on, it's called international cooperation. You know, as I like to say, everybody in this room probably has heard about the Paris Accords of 2015 under President Obama, which was a big, successful UN conference on climate where they came to a lot of conclusions. It was very successful. It was very exciting. It was very hopeful. The next one that you probably would have heard of is Glasgow, which was in 2021 under President Biden. In between, I would wager that very few people in this room can name a single place where a UN climate conference took place. And I will say, I went to a bunch of those conferences, and the US did not participate. No one showed up, and they had an office with a locked door, and that was our participation. So what scares me about this election is, if we're going to win globally, it's not like we're going to lead the world. The world's not going to get together without us. We're a necessary part of a world coalition to solve this in many ways, because we bring things to the table, hopefully including trust that we're trying to do the right thing. And if you look between 2015 and 2021, nothing really happened in terms of global cooperation. And what that means is it basically says to everybody in the world, the US isn't going to do it, so do whatever you want. And we're not going to work together. We're going to go to our neutral corners and come out fighting. And that is not helpful. So when I think about what this means, in so many ways, this election, in so many different areas, reflects, are we trying to be part of a bigger system and have a bigger view of who we care about and who we work with and who we feel some responsibility to? Or is it just us? And you can define the us however narrowly as you choose. But if you look around the world, an awful lot of this is about, are we cooperative members of the human race, or are we basically going to draw a fence around whatever we view as ourselves, and everybody outside the fence can do whatever?
Yeah, that's the test. So let's give Tom a round of applause and move on to questions. Here we come.
So I want you to know that in each one of these questions, I'm going to guess which family member is angry at me and decided to come up with a real zinger.
We'll start with an easy one. What does net zero mean?
So, net zero means that from a carbon emission standpoint, not that we have no carbon emissions, but that for every ton of carbon that we as a globe emit, we suck that much carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground. So that it's not we're at zero, but in terms of emissions minus sequestrations comes to zero. And just so you know, I mean, the goal has got to be that we're going to go to below zero. Net zero is the place where we stop the damage. We need to go below zero and net suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and I believe we'll do that.
If the market got us into trouble, why should we trust it to get us out?
So trusting capitalism, said a capitalist, is a dumb thing to do. Capitalists work within the laws of society. And if you look at the United States of America, the laws of society have permitted some things that today we would look at and say, under no circumstances would we ever permit that to happen again. It was all legal. What's great about capitalism is it really scales. If you think about what have we produced in the United States that's changed the world in this century, you look at a whole bunch of companies that have gone from nothing to the biggest companies in the world affecting billions of people around the globe. Capitalism and profits scale because you can hire people, you can raise money, you can organize things really efficiently, and you have a good measuring stick, otherwise known as profits. But you have to think about capitalism as amoral, because people are going to do what's legal. That's what they believe, that their job is to make money for their shareholders within the law. And so it's really important in a capitalist society that you also have a strong political system, governmental system, legal system that basically constrains people from doing things that are harmful to society and harmful to people in society.
Green energy is already cheaper than more traditional energy sources, and yet we're not making enough progress. Is it just a matter of time? How do we get people on board en masse if price doesn't seem to be making the difference?
This is actually a super interesting question and a little more complicated than it sounds like. And David and I were talking about this earlier because basically energy is not energy. When you think about solar and wind, I can tell you what it costs per kilowatt hour. But the one thing about solar is like there's this thing called night when solar is not that efficient. And there's this thing in wind, which is called, I guess, no wind. When if you're relying on it to run your refrigerator or run the generator in your hospital so people can have operations, that's called intermittent energy. I'll stop being so hilarious. So there's energy that you can rely on 24/7, 365. And there's energy which you can rely on most of the time and you can store. But basically, nowadays, when people talk about why do we have fossil fuels at all, the answer is not cost. It is, the basic argument is we need baseload fuel. We need the stuff.
Reliability.
Yeah. We need 24/7, 365. Having said that, okay, that happens to be true. We do need that. You know, we want hospitals to be up all the time. We don't want someone to die on the operating table because the wind's not blowing. So there are a number of ways to deal with this. I think the one that's going to be, and this is an investment question, it's a guess. It's a projection looking at a whole bunch of different technologies. There are a bunch of people working on this furiously in so many different ways. And an example of something that I feel really confident will be part of the solution is geothermal. You know, basically we're going to dig down into the earth and get steam and hot water and use that as an energy source that's completely clean. And that's something which people have traditionally gone down several hundred feet, and now they're going to go down several thousand feet. They're going to take oil and gas technology, oil and gas rigs, oil and gas employees, and basically do this. And it looks like it's going to be cheap enough. It's baseload fuel. And the question is, how big can it be? How much of this is there? My suspicion is when you start looking for something, it turns out there's a lot more of it than when you're not looking for it. And so the question is, what percentage of overall electricity generation can this be, and where can it be, and how pervasive can it be? Secondly, batteries I am a huge believer that we're going to have a series of battery revolutions, changes, and batteries cost.
We're already living in a revolution. I mean,
we are.
yeah.
They're down 80%, and they're going to down another 80%.
People talk about solar and wind, but batteries are on the same curve. Yeah.
Yes, but it's not just that. It's everything talks cost. The question for batteries is going to be duration. Like, how long can you store the stuff? If you can store the stuff for 3 months, then that's base load power. You know, the wind is going to blow. So I think we're going to have two real revolutions in batteries this decade. But having said that, I mean, when we think about how to do this and when we think about energy and we think about solar and wind, to get those up to the 80% level, to get them up to be the dominant parts, the truly dominant parts, they have to be the equivalent of baseload. They have to be something you can turn into baseload one way or another, because we do need 24/7, 365. And so there's probably 5 other things I could tell you right now where people are working furiously and people think, this is the thing, this is Golconda. Maybe, but what I do think is, of all those things, it's, you know, the cliche in technology, it's not going to be a silver bullet, it's going to be silver buckshot. There are going to be a lot of answers. And it's going to be the combination of the answers that's going to put us in a position where we can definitely do this. And that's why I'm confident, is I see so many different chances for things that can really scale into real size in a way that doesn't cost more but costs less and is better.
So we have a couple questions here about something you've mentioned a few times, which is carbon removal or sequestration. How big a part of the solution set is that going to be, do you think? How big an industry will the industrial parts of it be? How much will we be doing, you know, in agricultural sequestration, reforestation? How do you see all of that shaping out?
So here's some other meaningless numbers just to give you some perspective. People think that basically we emit about 42 gigatons of CO2 a year, 42 billion tons a year. And people think that by 2050, to get to that net zero, we're going to have to sequester at least 10 gigatons, which would imply it's a quarter of the solution. But nobody knows, because nobody knows how much we're going to be able to bring down that 42, and no one knows our ability to sequester 10 gigatons. So let's talk about that for 1 second. First of all, 10 gigatons at $100 a ton, and David was saying we think the social cost of carbon is $190 a ton or $200 a ton. That's $2 trillion of cash.
Every year.
So everyone in this room is going to claim they're going to sequester at least 1 million tons, I assume. People are going to want that money, and they're going to do a lot to get that money. And so the question is, that just to put a very simple frame on this, there are 2 schools of thought of how we're going to do this. One is mechanical. We're basically going to build machines. They're going to suck CO2 out of the air. Then we're going to build pipelines to take the CO2 and pipe it to empty caverns and empty oil fields, and we're going to stick it in the ground perpetually. That's one theory. That is a theory which the US government supports with billions of dollars, by the way. The other theory is that we're going to do it in nature, that we're going to change the way we farm, that we're going to grow different things, that basically suck it out and put it into roots and trunks and mangrove forests, and they stick it in the ocean, all these different things, and that we're going to be able to measure that and pay people around the world to change the way they farm so that they're in the global south where farmers often have very low incomes. We're going to be paying them first world cash money to sequester carbon in a place where they're making very little money. And that money is a huge game changer for them as families and as individuals. So all of this has a ton of tech behind it. It sounds like, oh, you change, subsistence farming in rural India, that's easy. If you're going to send trillions of dollars around the world with everybody in the world willing to take that money, I assure you we're going to have very good systems to measure it and to verify it, because we're not sending $2 trillion around the world to people who just say they're sequestering carbon. So there's going to be a lot of technology in how we do it. There's going to be a lot of technology in how we measure it. And there's going to be a lot of technology in terms of how we put those pieces together into an economic system to do it. So Sounds like a lot of work. It is a lot of work. Work we definitely can do. And as David very well knows, agriculture is the hidden part of this. People talk about electricity all the time. They talk about EVs all the time. They talk about, all the gadgets, heat pumps all the time. What people don't talk about is agriculture. And it's a huge part of the issue here, and it's also a huge part of the solution.
Last one is maybe a little heavy, but and long. It's on 2 pages. But we raised 2 kids in San Francisco. After the fires forced our kids to wear masks or stay home, along with socioeconomic issues relating to rising housing and construction costs, we moved to New York City in 2019.
They moved to New York because it's cheap. I want you guys. Did you hear that part? Okay, now we are narrowing this down very quickly.
I mean, also that, 2 years later, we had orange skies here, too. Our kids continued to wear masks through the pandemic, and now that they're teens applying for college, they seem averse to risk and don't want to live far from home. Many of their peers also don't want kids because they don't believe our planet can sustain humans for that long. How do you recommend we approach framing this topic and talk about it, given the experiences of the world's young?
So I have confronted this, I would say. I think having children is one of the most optimistic things you can do, and also something that it seems like is a pretty important part for society as well as every human being on the planet. So I'm a big believer in kids. I'm also a big believer, and I keep saying this, and I think I'm not saying it well, because I believe that solving this problem together is going to be a massively wonderful winning experience for us. And I think that we need to remember what it is like to win as a society and to do important things together and to realize the strength and decency of other people. And so when I think about that story, I think we need to remember that actually we're a very innovative, resourceful, brave group of people, and we should act like it. And we should remember that, and we should take that attitude into the world, and we should take that attitude into this crisis. I think my kids hated me for saying it, but when they were playing sports, I always said, you gotta bring a little swagger. It's like, you gotta show up and say, okay, we don't know how this is gonna turn out. You don't know, but we should have confidence in ourselves, and that confidence is gonna help us be one of the ways we win. And winning is going to be an incredibly important experience for this society to remember that we can pull together and that people in Texas are resourceful and smart and decent and patriotic. And so are people in the Northeast, and so are people in the Midwest and California. And so I really feel strongly that it's important for people to remember that was what I learned traveling around this country. We are a very decent, smart, strong people in this country, and we should remember that and pull together to win this. And that's what I really care about.
Well, round of applause for winning.
Who doesn't like to win?